the conference organisers and the committee, and hello to everyone here. The title of this paper is a quote from an anthropologist I greatly admired, who, when hearing that I studied Roman pottery, uttered the line, "But why? Surely the men have done it all already." And I don't know whether she was being serious or playing devil's advocate. However, at the time, it irked me greatly, and it's continued to niggle away. So when Eniko and I were discussing a paper looking at the demographics within Roman pottery studies, it seemed like a good time to explore this a little further. So some caveats. I appreciate the European nature of the SGRP, and we've got people here today from across the globe, but I am going to be focusing specifically on Romano-British pottery studies. If anyone's got any other data, I'm happy to continue the conversation through conference style. And also, there are so many brilliant people in this group, I'm not going to be able to mention everyone, so please don't think I've forgotten you. When I'm talking about gender in this talk, I recognise that it's a basic binary division of male-female, and it lacks any aspects of intersectionality. And to clarify, intersectionality is a term put forward by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which built on the work of many women of colour feminist theorists. It relates to how gender, race, ethnicity and sexuality are all interlinked, so identity and systems of oppression don't work in isolation. I'm sticking to the simple binary gender division here because in looking at the publications, I've used the basic name identification, and where we do have other data, because we are such a small group of people, it could make individuals identifiable or feel identifiable, and that's not my aim. I'll also say from the start that it's not my experience of working in Roman pottery for around 25 years that the men are doing it all. I've always found Romano-British pottery studies to be welcoming, supportive, and without the misogyny and sexism that can exist in the wider workplace. Most of the commercial pottery specialists I know are female. The Roman pottery team that I currently work in is comprised of 3 women. When I was thinking about the title for this paper, it also struck me that most of the references I cite in my work are still by male authors. So in looking at the survey data, the survey that was sent around to the membership, I was also interested in the visibility of specialists in general, and more specifically, the female specialists. We're going to be reflecting a lot, not just in this session, but I think across the conference on where we've come from, where we are now, and where we're going, and also about how we attract and retain people within pottery studies. So hopefully this paper will initiate a good discussion. Can I have the next slide, please, Eniko? So we all know in the early days of Romano-British pottery studies, it was pretty much the men doing it all, and a simple Google search will provide all the names. For people who are interested, the Roman Pottery in Britain book by Paul Tyers provides a really good background. The section is all about men. There's one woman who makes an appearance in a photograph of Thomas May, as you can see here at Richborough, and conversations with the librarian at the Society of Antiquities where this collection is held. We think it's Lady Clawson, as they were staying at Richborough at the time. Similarly, Colin Wallace in the journal, volume 3, provides a really useful background to key players and sites, and again, the women are noticeably absent. If anyone here is interested in the more general history of women in archaeology, then Rachel Pope recently gave a brilliant presentation for the Australasian Women in Ancient World Studies conference earlier this year, and that covers the early days of British archaeologists, looking at women's access to university, marriage bars, and other factors that impacted on the presence and visibility of women in archaeology. And at the end of this talk, I've got a link to Dr. Pope's talk. We don't really have, or I haven't found any data that looks back at the demographic of archaeologists prior to 1990 and the changes brought by PPG 16. And in terms of women and Romano-British pottery, then, in the post-war period, early names, Eileen Fox has already been mentioned, Grace Simpson. In the 50s and 60s, we've got people like Felicity Wilde and Kay Hartley, and women are starting to make an impact. The Pendrell Hall meeting that's already been mentioned to plan the CBA conference on Romano-British pottery, as Chris Young was saying, is by invitation only, but in the list that Chris put up, you could see that of the 14 people, there are at least 6, possibly 7 women, including Joanna Bird, Kay Hartley, Vivian Swan, Maggie Darling, Val Rigby. So, we had good representation right at the start of the group. And similarly, in the 1980s steering group to produce the guidelines on the processing and publication of Roman pottery, again, there were 9 women and 16 men. As already Chris mentioned this morning, Vivian Swan, who's already been mentioned, she's one of the first pottery people I encountered, and I know I'm not the only woman who received support and encouragement from her. And while many of the typologies undertaken in the 70s and 80s were by men, Isabel Thompson's work on Belgic potteries is still a key reference. We've got Anna Shepherd's work on pottery methodology, Pam Irving and Sue Laughlin credited for contributions to early computer applications to pottery studies. And then in the mid-90s, we had Beth Richardson, Barbara Davis and Roberta Tomba publishing the corpus of early Roman pottery from the City of London. And there are many, many more good examples. What I want to do is look at our own membership data. Could I have the next slide, please? And I just wanted to highlight some of the other data that I'm going to be referring to in this talk. So the various profiling profession surveys and the Survey of Archaeological Specialists by Landward Research provide a background to the profession. The specialist survey data covers a range of specialisms, one of which is archaeological find study, which is further broken down to finds types and within pottery to period. And for Roman, it's also split into amphora, Samian, stamped Samian, and then all other Romano-British pottery. So it kind of both helps or not, because obviously people will have might have ticked more than one area of research. In addition, back in 2018, I ran a survey of the CIFA Finds group, which provides an additional level of more specialist data. And thank you to all of you that responded to the survey that went out to the SGRP membership a few months ago. And those questions were based on these sector surveys and the previous survey of the SGRP that Andrew Peachy did in 2009, which was published in the Archaeologist. Next slide. And I'm going to be looking at some of those results now. So if we look at gender, as stated earlier, it's basic binary division. Until the latest profiling profession, other genders weren't recorded. And even now the figures are so low that within the latest survey, they've been merged into one group. It's about 1%. But according to profiling profession in the UK, 53% of archaeologists are male, 47% are female, which correlates with the UK workforce. And this has taken decades to reach this point, as in the 1997 report, women comprised just 35% of the archaeological workforce. And if we go back to the IFA membership in 1991, of the 900 or so members, just 26% were female. The 2016 Survey of Archaeological Specialists showed the reverse of this, with 46% of specialists male and 54% female. And like I said, the different specialisms are broken down. So of the 330 that identified as find specialists, 36 specified Romano-British pottery. And that actually gives an even more dramatic figure of 35% male and 65% female. So we know there are patterns within the archaeological sector. We know that women are located in larger numbers in certain specialist areas. Women form more of the younger cohort of archaeologists. Men are better represented in senior roles. So I wondered if we could see this at the smaller level of Roman pottery studies within our group. Next slide. So certainly there are more younger women than men within the group, although the best represented age category for both is 65 plus. We know we have a problem with the lack of new specialists coming in. It was one of the top concerns cited by the members in the survey, as it was back in 2009. And I think Chris mentioned earlier, that was a concern pretty much from the start. 50% of the men who responded are age 65 plus and 35% of women. So combined, it's just over 40% of the SGRP membership. 79% of SGRP are aged 45 plus. And by way of comparison, the latest statistics for the Royal Archaeological Institute, 78% of their membership are over 60 and only 5.5% are under 40. So we're doing better than some. And also, as has been said, we are a study group. We're a very mixed group of people with a wide range of interest in Roman pottery studies. British women archaeologists have highlighted, using the profiling profession data, that women leave the profession in their 30s, but not so it would seem in pottery. Women outnumber the men in both the 35 to 44 and 45 to 54 age categories. Next slide, please. And I will mention, actually, incidentally, the lowest paid specialisms are also those that are female dominated, archives and finds. Pay is out of the scope of this paper, but I will flag up that in that survey of specialists, the charge out rates for male specialists was higher than for women, with a mean charge out rate of £273 for men versus 218 for women. And finds generally was the third lowest paid specialist area above archives and illustration. So what roles do people take within the SGRP? As you can see here, women are purple, if that's just missing off the bottom of the screen, yellow male, purple female. Women are most prevalent in specialist roles within organisations and as freelance specialists. So specialists in organisations are 3 times more likely to be female than male. Men, however, hold a larger number of senior, managerial and academic roles, all listed retired. So men are more likely to be managers in archaeological organisations, and they're between 4 and 4.5 times more likely to be academics or class themselves as independent researchers. So how does this translate into what we do? Who's doing what and how visible are we? The survey asked about a number of papers and presentations given in the last 5 years that included or were primarily about Roman pottery. Next slide. So you can see here 42% of respondents had given no presentations. About a third had given 1 to 2. 15% had given 5 or more presentations. Can I have the next slide? There we go. Within this, you can see here men in the group were 4 times more likely to have given more presentations. Is this age related? Possibly. I suspect there are other factors at play here as well. Is it men that tend to hold these more senior positions or who are retired, who have the time and the funding to be able to both prepare and present? And it will be interesting to see if the rise in online conferences enabled a more diverse participation. Anecdotally, some of the online projects over the period of furlough showed that a much higher number of young female professionals were engaging than their male counterparts. Is it that those working in commercial organisations aren't, for whatever reason, either being given the opportunities or the encouragement to do more of this? You know, presenting is often voluntary, and when you're working under time constraints, it can be quite an additional mental and financial stress to undertake these voluntary presentations. So I wanted to see if there were similar trends in terms of publications. The survey asked 2 questions on the subject of publication, one looking at specialist contributions to a range of different publication formats, and another around primary authorship in these publications. I asked these questions as reviewing authorship of Roman pottery publications proved to be trickier than I'd at first envisaged. The SGRP bibliography is a fantastic resource, but when I was searching on the ADS, it didn't seem to be currently up to date. I tried searching on ADS, and unfortunately, and I'm hoping this might change with the new OASIS forms, you can pull up reports with Roman pottery, but have to open every report to access the specialist name. And I think that invisibility of specialists, not just Roman pottery specialists, is quite an issue, as well as being personally quite frustrating. Next slide. So here we have the contributions and publications. So given that almost 50% of the membership identified as specialists, either within an organisation or freelance, it's not surprising that contributions to client reports ranked highly, particularly with women, as they're more likely to hold these roles. Likewise with standalone publications, as these are often site-specific monographs, but obviously can cover a range of topics. Next slide. If we look at primary authors, though, you can see there's quite a difference. Men scored more highly in all categories, except the none of these, which is the dark green. So most of the women that answered hadn't been a primary author in any reports in these publications. So this is rather concerning and rather depressing. We've seen that it's not the men doing all the work, so what is going on here? There have been previous studies looking at gender equity in terms of archaeological publications, most notably Gero in 1985 and Sociopolitics and the Woman at Home ideology, which showed for the first time the extent to which men dominated publications and grant awards. And there have been a series of follow-on studies, admittedly with a strong North American focus, over the last 3 to 4 decades. Most recently, Heath Stout's survey, which explored not just gender, but that intersectionality of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality that I mentioned at the start. So this got me thinking, and I looked at our own Journal of Roman Pottery Studies. I went through the journals and did a basic count of single author papers, male, female, and multi-authored papers. I excluded reviews and also the 3 volumes that focus on site-specific forms. Can I have the next slide, please? And here we go. So green male, the yellowy orange colour is female, and purple is papers that are authored by both male and female. And we reach parity around volume 12, which incidentally is the volume dedicated to Kay Hartley. Thereafter, women do seem to be more present in terms of proportions of paper authors, except for volume 17, bizarrely, which is either all male or mixed. Basically, 62% of the single author papers across JPRS are by men. Now, I belong to the Mentoring Women in Archaeology and Heritage online group, and when people ask for Roman pottery resources, the one most often cited is Potsherd. So I thought I'd take a look there. The Pottery website is a brilliant resource I dip into on occasion. I'm sure lots of people here today also still do that. It also provides quite a good snapshot of publications. The latest publication listed, however, is 1994. The vast majority are pre-1990. Under British sources, I looked at the British courseware references, and of the 62 publications listed, just 6 were by single women authors. So that's 68% by male authors. Now, going back to Heath Stout's survey, how does this compare with the more general trend, more archaeology-related publications? 2 journals in her study are published in the UK, and these figures are comparable to the figures for the Cambridge Journal of Archaeology, which comes in at 62%, and Antiquity, which comes in at 67%. But finds work is traditionally more female-dominated. We've seen this, and we experience it daily, many of us. So how come even in this area, we're not more visible? My personal experience of working as a commercial pottery specialist is that there are many more women than men engaged in these roles, as we've seen in the previous slides. Fulkerson and Tushingham in 2019 postulated that the economic structures of archaeological work lead to a disproportionate number of women producing large amounts of archaeological knowledge. In the UK, we can see that in our Grey Lit library. And as Heath Stout points out, the woman at home ideology made real. Is finds work the equivalent of housekeeping? That's not how I see it. Yet over recent years, I have come to question how the situating of women in finds work impacts on career progressions. And I think there are 2 factors at play here. I do think we're victim to the wider sector views that diminish the value of finds specialists. And I actually think that starts at the university level, certainly used to. I mean, how many times are those who are considered physically unfit or otherwise unsuitable get sent to work in the finds hut? I know my own experience, admittedly many years ago at university, that was definitely the case. And I do know of colleagues even now who would prefer to take annual leave rather than spend time processing finds. Women in archaeology have been concerned about this situation for 30 years at least. The Equal Opportunities in Archaeology Working Group of the IFA, as it was then back in 1991, published a report in The Archaeologist where they highlighted the following problems: the polarisation of women into finds work, the paucity of women in positions of power and authority in the archaeological profession, and they also cited unhelpful attitudes in the profession, the chilly climate. And I quote some of the quotes from their survey. Many women tend to graduate towards finds work, which has proved to be a backwater in terms of the more senior field posts. And also, in general, women are expected to do finds work and it's regarded as second rate to excavation. Now, I think everybody in this room would strongly disagree with that thought process. But, there's also the view that we can become too specialist to then manage or to move out of finds work, an increasing tendency within organisations to create generalist specialists. We're at real risk here of being de-skilled. And by generalist specialists, it's people who want to become pottery specialists or specialists in other finds, not actually being given that opportunity to develop that in-depth knowledge, but instead having, an amazing range of lots of information about lots of finds type, but not that real in-depth knowledge. And Jane Evans, in her paper at the CIFA Finds Group conference a few years ago, highlighted these problems, and she actually used examples of 3 female pottery specialists and their careers over a 30-year period. Why is all of this important? Well, these are trends affecting the wider sector rather than women pottery specifically, but I think it's something that we need to be aware of when we're considering how attractive a career in pottery may be to those starting out. These things affect how we're perceived by colleagues, within the profession. It impacts on funding, on recognition, on inclusion, some of the factors, some of the issues that Chris mentioned in his paper. Can I have the next slide, please? So to summarise, we've shown that there are more women than men in finds work, and it's the opposite to the profession as a whole. Women don't leave find specialisms as they do in other sectors, most notably fieldwork. Men are more likely to give the presentations and to be primary authors. They do earn more. I didn't present those findings with it. It's quite a small group, so I didn't go down that route in this talk. And they're more likely to hold senior roles, and they're more likely to be visible in terms of outreach and publication. Are we unwitting victims of the women at home ideology while thinking we're holding down a career in archaeology? It's often been cited, like I said, that women choose or encouraged to go into finds work. As it's more conducive to holding down a career whilst navigating family commitments. And I've heard that a lot, and I've been guilty of myself of saying that to other women when they've been trying to decide which path to take in archaeology. But, you know, I've got a bit of an issue with that now, as I think in long term it does remove women from those more senior roles. Is it simply a matter of time? We've seen that more women are entering the profession, so will this balance eventually tip? But do we need to be more proactive as a group? Do we actively need to seek to promote Romano-British pottery PhDs, you know, mentorship programs? You know, do we need to disrupt the system, you know, if we're going to protect our Roman pottery specialisms? I started my journey in Roman pottery studies in 1998 under the guidance of Paul Booth at Oxford Archaeology. And with hindsight, I realised, you know what, how lucky I was to actually have that opportunity. I also worked with Vivian Swan early on in my career, and I really appreciate all the inspiring people I've met through this group and the many pottery specialists I've worked with, all genders. I think the issues this paper is flagging up shows that it's not individual specialists, it's the system in which we find ourselves working. You know, we've been aware of these issues for most of the history of the finds group, and you know, things aren't changing, and we're rapidly reaching crisis point. At the moment, we seem to be largely and passively reliant on the older and retired members of the group to do the research. Personally, I'm quite looking forward to when I retire and I can do all the research that I haven't been able to do while I'm working. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying there's no drive within the system to facilitate those working at the face, so to speak, to do more than churn out the basic requirements of the client reports. So over the last 50 years, well, certainly since PPG 16, you know, we've become established within the sector. We are valued. We need to attract more specialists. We hold a phenomenal amount of knowledge between us, but we kind of feel like we're a resource in need of protection ourselves now. So what I'm hoping is that we can use this data in some way. And I will give a copy of all the survey findings to the committee. And I hope that, you know, they can use that to look at the different ways we can attract new specialists that we're in dire need of recruiting. And I think that's going to be touched on in some of the papers later this morning. So I hope this paper has given some interesting figures and some data that the SGRP can use in support, you know, of highlighting the work that we do and in tackling the issues that we're facing. Thank you.